So I'm pleased to introduce to you today Ken Paulson. He is the Dean Emeritus of the College of Media and Entertainment at MTSU, and he's now serving as the founding director of the Free Speech Center. He is a First Amendment expert. Paulson has written and been quoted widely on First Amendment issues, and he is also the holder of a law degree from the University of Illinois College of Law, and he's a member of both the Illinois and the Florida bars, and has spent much of his career as a journalist, educator, and an advocate for First Amendment values. He's the former editor-in-chief of USA Today and continues to write columns for the newspaper on First Amendment and media issues. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Ken Paulson.
Thank you, Dr. Pitts. It's an honor to be here, and I'm delighted to talk to you about a subject that is very near and dear to my heart, a free press. I have just always been in love with American journalism. At age 7, I created my first neighborhood newspaper. Now, that involved crayons and notebook paper, and I had no way to reproduce it, but I would hand one page out to each neighbor hoping that they would share. It was a very primitive model, but I never kicked that. I've always loved being a part of the newspaper world and the journalism world, and frankly went to law school for the express purpose of becoming an investigative reporter, and all that has served me well. It is a subject, the press is a subject that is much discussed, often maligned, and often studied. And I just wanted to share with you something I came across actually 2 days ago. This was in the newspaper and online, something out of USA Today. It is a study done by NBC News and Generation Lab, and they did a survey of who do incoming college students trust. And we see there, they're saying it's parents. It's a very odd survey, and I find so many of these to be not very valuable. What this does, the question to students, people who are entering colleges this semester, was, who do you trust most? In what institutions and what people do you trust the most? It shouldn't surprise anyone. It shouldn't take a survey to establish the most 18-year-olds in America having to make a decision about, well, what entity do they trust most, is going to be, they're going to pick the people who have fed and clothed them and very possibly paid their college tuition this semester. That should be a no-brainer. Does it surprise me that the young people trust their parents more than they do their state senator? Yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all. It's exactly what you would expect to have happen. And there are a lot of studies like this. One other quality about this is that in addition to this appearing under this headline, it appeared in a lot of other news organizations, websites and in newspapers saying students trust parents more than they trust media. Again, duh, of course, that's not hard to figure out, but it is part of the self-flagellation that is American news media, that whenever they have a chance to make themselves look bad, they do that. I don't know why. I've done it for a very long time. There's a cultural reason for this, but here's what this article actually says. It says that young people entering college trust their parents. They also trust their local police. They also trust their local officials. They also trust their local news media. And there's every opportunity to make that clear. The essence of the study is 18-year-olds trust things close to their home or in their home more than they trust national organizations, national media, national institutions. And it's a very, very odd thing. It also makes the point that less than half trust the president. Well, the same survey says that President Biden has a 56% approval rate. So they're really just talking about the institution of president here. Bottom line for me, this is a wasted survey. Has no value whatsoever, and I've just offended NBC News and the Generation Lab. But what I do like about this survey is they actually asked about local media. They actually made a distinction between the media, which half of America doesn't trust at all, and local news media. And whenever you talk about the press, it's critically important to understand what the press is. It is not MSNBC. It is not Fox. It is not angry people yelling at each other on cable television. That's such a small percentage of American journalism. The true American journalism takes place in your hometown. Think about the state of Tennessee. Does it have any national news organizations? No. Does it have a statewide national news organization? Not really. There's probably an aggregation of the NPR stations where they probably share some content. Is there a statewide newspaper? No. There are multiple newspapers. Again, they share some content. Every form of media in the state is local. And what they cover are things in our collective backyard. And 95%, at least 95%, those who are employed by news organizations, by the press, and by the press I want to make clear, I'm talking here about those who share local information, well, any information with you, news and information. It doesn't actually have to be created on a printing press anymore because every electronic medium now has a website, and that's free press as well. Just for fun, I went back into the archives, actually the bedroom closet of my home, dug out a box and began to scan some stories I wrote as a rookie reporter, just to give you a sense of what it's like to be a newspaper reporter even today. So sometimes you cover stories where mishaps occur. In this case, a gentleman falling in a 6-story fall. And when you do that, if you're a local reporter, you have to treat it with respect. You try not to exploit people, and you try to get all the information so the public is not left wondering. There are other times people get really lucky. Pilot forgot to set down his landing gear, and somehow he still survived. That's a good story. It's a positive one, you can tell. Then sometimes people are kind of stupid and unlucky. This is loose trailer injures policeman. I have to share with you, this is only the second time that Ken Paulson, photographer, was published. My first professional photograph was Elvis Presley, believe it or not. That's another story. It was the fat Elvis period, but he was pretty amazing. So here's my second published photograph. But I've often thought about this. How unlucky can you be to have the trailer you're towing come undone, and the only vehicle behind you is a police car? That's a magical level of unluckiness. And I was there to document it as a very green young reporter. Sometimes the stories involve a bit more than just recording what happened. This story is really kind of interesting and investigative of a sort. I'm a music geek, have always been. Lifelong collection of records, CDs, MP3s, everything means a lot to me. So I started in the business as a 16-year-old music writer. As a young police reporter, I'm covering everything that moves in the city of Fort Myers, Florida, and I hear there's an ad for an upcoming show, and it involved, let's see, the bands were Eddie Money, Cactus, and Ozark Mountain Daredevils, and it was going to be at the local armory. And alarms went off for me because it made absolutely no sense. It would be like you're driving down the road and you hear an ad, and it's going to be a magical combination of Garth Brooks, Megan Thee Stallion, and Eminem. And you'd go, wait, there's something wrong here, right? And that's what I did back in the late 70s. And I just said, there's something wrong here. And I started making calls to the bands, and sure enough, they weren't coming. There was no show. It was a fraud. And they were selling tickets to a show that didn't exist. But that's also part of American newspaper. And even on the smallest level, young journalists and older journalists are looking for things that don't sound quite right and to ask questions. I'm confident I have not shared anything with you today that makes you think I was a Pulitzer Prize winner or this was a particularly glamorous job. But I want to share with you maybe my favorite story I had the opportunity to cover of all. A topless wedding. I had come in from a fire, had to cover a fire. It was a brush fire, and what police tell you then is stay away from the edges of the forest because snakes come rushing out of a fire. So, but I was tired. I'm done now, and the city editor calls me over and says, "Hey, go over to this topless bar. They're having a wedding." And so I dutifully do that. And like just genuinely terrified. Half the people in the room didn't have clothes on, and the music was loud and it was raucous. But here's a happy wedding, the gentleman was a regular customer of the bar and married one of the dancers. They didn't have money for rings, so they took beer top rings and wore those. It was a pretty magical evening. And of course, Fort Myers, Florida is a conservative community, so the next day when the story was run, we had howls of outrage, the immorality of reporting on this story. But it is one of my more memorable stories. And finally, this is an example of the boring stuff local reporters have to cover all the time. It's the reason a topless wedding gets your attention, is because this kind of story, what the city council did today, what the zoning board has decided about mobile homes on certain properties, what has been approved or disapproved by government, what has been proposed, gets covered voraciously by newspapers and news organizations and TV stations. Less today than before because they don't have the staff they once had. But the notion has always been that a free press is there to keep an eye on those in power. And so very often reporters do this every day. Now, I share this with you because the public sense of the press, you know, when you ask them today about the media, they immediately flash on cable television and partisan coverage. MSNBC and Fox have nothing to do with journalism, no matter what they call themselves. It's propaganda, it's entertainment, it is a reality show that has no reality in much of it. And people do themselves an extraordinary disservice by making those their sole news diets. No, most of American journalism is in fact in your backyard, about your hometown, and about the people you know, whether it is the boring planning and zoning meeting, the outrageous thing that's going on at the strip club, or the local football team. American journalism remains actually in very good shape, but no one believes it. And the biggest tragedy is that fewer people are subscribing to the local newspaper. And the reason they say is because it's biased. Never, and I will tell you, this will date me badly, Jimmy Carter was the president when I wrote this. If I had an attitude about Jimmy Carter, if I wanted to do him badly, if I was biased against Jimmy Carter, there's no way in my job I could have done anything about that. Where was I going to slip in an attack on Jimmy Carter? I didn't. There was no way to do that. I'm writing about Fort Myers, Florida. So this perception that local newspapers, local television stations, they have this media bias, it's nonsense. It's largely made up of underpaid people who work long hours and try their best to get it right, because only by getting it right do they get to come back the next day and do their jobs. And although I'm describing something here in the late 70s, as you can tell, not even my article, there's no color, there's no color in any of these. As long ago as that seems to be, it is exactly the same model of local newspapering today, except that when they have that boring story they have to write about, they also tweet about it. And they perhaps be able to work up an Instagram about it. Now, since the beginning of newspapering in America, this has been the case. Reporters have written things that offend people in power, and people in power try to limit access to that information. This is the very first newspaper published in America. Public occurrences, both foreign and domestic. It appeared in 1690, so you know it's well before there was a First Amendment. And one of the articles in this first newspaper in America, the very first day of publication, was about the King of France sleeping with his daughter-in-law. So you know that reporting on big shots involved in sex scandals is a great American tradition, going back to day one of American newspapering. It was shut down the same day, and we did not have a newspaper in America for 14 years. That's how chilling the shutdown was. But it established a pattern. We're going to publish, and you're not going to be happy with us. The next pivotal moment comes in 1735, and this involves John Peter Zenger. And Zenger was a guy who published a newspaper that had no pretense. No, it didn't pretend to be a balanced newspaper. It was called the New York Weekly Journal. It was hired by people who were opposed to the colonial governor of New York, And that's where newspapers originally came from. People, again, talk about media bias. They were all biased for the first half century of American newspapering, because you started newspapers to get at your political rivals, to report about your political rivals. There was no revenue from Staples or Home Depot or Kmart or Walmart or any other revenue source that paid any meaningful money. It was just about selling papers to people who agreed with you. Not too far from the current cable model. But Zenger ended up writing unflattering things about Governor William Cosby of New York, and Cosby decided he was going to have Zenger prosecuted. Now, what Zenger wrote was true, but it was unflattering. And in the reasoning of the era, writing about something that's bad and being truthful was even worse than making it up, because it was true, and that could really damage your reputation. It was a perverse way of looking at the free flow of information. But it goes to trial, and a very learned Philadelphia lawyer came in and argued to the jury that you can't prosecute somebody for telling the truth. All the law required, by the way, at the time was that it was published, it was negative, and it made people think less of the governor. That's all you had to do to win that. And this guy came in, Hamilton came in and said, no, that's not fair, that's wrong, and I urge you to ignore the law, what is now called jury nullification. I urge you to ignore the law, and I urge you to set this man free, and that's what happened. And it was a very popular decision. And it was sort of the torch that lit what was to come 55 years later with the adoption of the Bill of Rights. It established a principle that America would embrace, that you cannot be punished for being truthful in what you share and report. Well, all this, of course, culminates in a pretty pivotal moment in American history, the establishment of the U.S. Constitution and then the Bill of Rights. And I want to share with you a brief story about the coming of the Bill of Rights that you probably have never heard. I don't know why our schools don't teach this, but I doubt very much if this ever came up in the 4th grade. And yet it is arguably the most important date in American history. What occurred is this country was in difficult places in the 1780s. You know, we'd fought the war, the Revolutionary War, exhausted a lot of resources. We were vulnerable to attack from others still. And the economy was foundering. There was armed rebellion in Massachusetts. A real question about how this young nation could survive and continue to exist, let alone thrive. And so a group called the Federalists decided they were going to come up with a new plan, a blueprint for the future. If you've seen Hamilton, you know generally what I'm talking about. They were going to draft a new operating manual for America called the Constitution, establishing an executive branch, a legislative branch, a judicial branch, and there would be checks and balances. And that was a remarkable document. They shared it with newspapers. That was how you could get the word out and get support for this new Constitution. Those are called the Federalist Papers. And then they went for ratification. America was going to be rebooted. Obviously, they didn't use that language, but what it was, they maintained the operating system of liberty and justice for all, that notion, that freedom notion, but they built in a lot more features, including a separation of powers. And America was asked, are we going to do this? And surprisingly, to our modern sensibilities, is that they could not get enough support for the Constitution. They did not have enough states supporting it. So our most sacred document as a country was initially rejected by the American people. And then something happened that never happens or rarely happens in America today. There was a compromise. And the American people, through their representatives, came back and said, okay, we get it, we need a stronger central government. There's no coordination between states, we're not moving in the right direction. We'll support that, but you've got to give us some guarantees. You won't put soldiers in a home in peacetime. You won't subject us to unreasonable search and seizure. If we're accused of a crime, we have a right to a jury trial. We like guns. We want to be able to have our well-regulated militia keep and bear arms. And then we also, and this is very important to us, we want to worship the God of our choice. We want to be able to say whatever we want without punishment. If we think things aren't going really well, we demand the right to petition government for change. And if we're really unhappy, we have the right to go into the public square and raise our voices in protest. And you may not shoot us, no more Boston massacres. And one more thing we demand before we will ratify this Constitution, we demand a free press. You may end up naming George Washington as President of the United States. Good guy, we respect him. But we don't trust anyone with that much power. And we need an institution that keeps an eye on people in power, keeps government in check, and also, by the way, make sure all these other promises we're asking for are kept. So from the very beginning of our nation, the watchdog role was established for free press. I have to tell you, my biggest surprise in law school was graduating. This stunned me and everyone else I knew. But beyond that was the beauty of contract law, a course that I anticipated would be deadly dull. And instead it was revelatory. Life is messy, a lot of ambivalence. There are times you know where you stand with your employer, your colleagues, your significant other, and other days you don't have a clue. But a contract spells it out. You buy an iPad and it doesn't work. The back of that receipt from Best Buy says, bring it back, we'll give you your money back. You buy a car, you stop paying, that contract says, we have a right to take it back. It spells out perfectly the relationship between the American people and their government. And what occurred in 1788 in this country was a contract between the American people and their government. In exchange for the power of the government, we demanded the power of the people. And as you all know from your personal and professional lives, if you enter into a contract and one party fails to uphold that, that contract is null and void. If we as a nation don't daily affirm our right to the liberties contained in the Bill of Rights, the document that would come about to guarantee these freedoms, if we don't fight for those, stand for those, if we're complacent about those, the kind of country we aspire to be, one founded on principles of liberty and justice, that can become null and void. And we cannot allow that to happen. And a major player in making sure that has never happened to date is America's free press. And it is not a coincidence that those who seek more power in this country or any country, the first thing you do is try to attack the credibility of those who will call you out when you do bad things. And you will see this in democracies, and you will see this in totalitarian countries where those press outlets have no freedom and often are government owned. But what happened that day was a very big deal. It set the tone for America for the next 2 centuries plus. Let's look at the 45 words of the First Amendment while we're at it. 45 words, unchanged since 1791, but not unchallenged. The 5 freedoms are the same ones I've just cited with you. You have the right to religion. Government can't start a religion. Government can't inhibit your exercise of religion. You have the right to speak out freely. You have the right to write and to report and to have others write and report for you. You have the right to assemble. You have the right to petition. Those 5 together protect our freedom of conscience. We are allowed to think whatever we want, say whatever we want, write whatever we want, and convey through marches and other forms of communication exactly what we believe. That has never happened before in American history. It has never happened before in the history of the world, is the truth. And although you have many, many countries who today, when I talk about America being the freest nation in terms of these 5 freedoms, I will hear from students who are from other countries, who say, well, we're good. But then you take a hard look and you go, well, what's with the scarves? You can't wear scarves if you're of a certain faith in France. What is that about? A lot of countries believe they are free, but they fail short of the vibrant freedom this country has to offer. I want to share with you how these freedoms, how these 45 words have been pivotal in protecting the public's right to know, and have been pivotal in maintaining our right to report aggressively about people in power. Here's a really big deal out of 1960. This is an ad that came at the height of the civil rights movement, and it's a group of civil rights leaders calling out the South, calling out specifically the Montgomery Police Department, Montgomery, Alabama. And it's appeared in the New York Times, and it basically says, what you're doing here is unjust, and our cause is very just, and you need to protect you need to protect our exercise of the First Amendment, and we need society to change. Historic and highly important message here. Well, what occurred is this offended the good people of Montgomery, Alabama, including L.B. Sullivan, who was the Montgomery, Alabama Police Commissioner. Now, Mr. Sullivan's not mentioned anywhere in this ad. And yet he was offended by it. And he filed suit against the New York Times, asking to be compensated because they had maligned him. Now, just as in Zenger's case, where we laid out what it was they had to meet, the law had changed some, but not that much. And basically, in the early 1960s in Alabama, you could recover if you showed that what was written was not entirely true, and that it hampered somebody's reputation. And here's what's interesting. The part that wasn't true was just they were simple errors. They had nothing to do with Mr. Sullivan. They had no specific impact on public impression of the reputation of the Montgomery Police Department. One of the mistakes was how many times Martin Luther King Jr. had been jailed. And they got that number a little wrong. They also got wrong what song the protesters sang as they engaged in the protests. It didn't matter that these were terribly relevant inaccuracies. All they had to be was inaccurate for L.B. Sullivan to win. And L.B. Sullivan indeed won this lawsuit at the trial level. He was awarded $5,000 for the damage to his reputation, which was non-existent. By the way, there were like 15 copies of the New York Times for sale in Alabama, the entire state. But the fact that one copy had gotten in gave them the weapon they needed to bring a suit. Now, this wasn't about, or just about, L.B. Sullivan's hurt feelings. This was the best possible way to short-circuit the civil rights movement. If you could sue a newspaper into oblivion because they made a mistake, an innocent mistake, then suddenly the New York Times is going home. They're not going to report on racial injustice in Alabama. You can bankrupt all those troublesome newspapers that are reporting on racial injustice, and they're going home. And that story will not be told. And then in an astonishingly important case, 9-0. Back when we actually had nonpartisan Supreme Court, perceived to be nonpartisan anyway, they could all agree on this very important principle, that freedom of the press has to give, the very act of exercising free press rights, there has to be some protection there. If some remedy given for libel just smothers a free press and it's gone forever, those rights no longer exist. And our country is dependent upon a free press. Even critics will acknowledge the importance of a free press in reporting what's going on. And they said, okay, if you're reporting on a public official, there's got to be a little space for error. And if, as a journalist, you are covering this and you're acting in good faith and trying to tell the truth, and you get a mistake, you make a mistake about a public official, you cannot be held liable for that. And that's the Times v. Sullivan case. It changed everything. It freed newspapers and television stations up to do real investigative reporting. As long as they engage in good faith reporting, they could report about things that upset public officials without fear of being sued. Now, people can still sue them, but it would be dismissed very quickly. And without that, you would never have seen the kind of reporting we saw around Watergate. You would not have seen the kind of aggressive reporting that we've seen in the last half century. It is a stunningly important decision. And the standard, by the way, was called actual malice. And it means you can only be held liable if you were intentionally reporting something untruthful, or you recklessly, unprofessionally publish something without adequately checking it out. So bad journalists can still be punished, but well-meaning, public-spirited journalists have protections, and that just, frankly, that turned freedom of the press into something much more powerful, important, and valuable in American society. The other thing I want to share with you is the story of the Pentagon Papers. Again, the First Amendment coming to the rescue. The war in Vietnam was raging in the early 70s when this decision came down. You were exactly draft age. The young men in this group, you all would have actually probably have draft numbers now, but we all knew that we could end up serving in Vietnam. And it was a deeply unpopular war. And there was a strong suspicion that the government was not being as candid with us as it should have been about the likelihood for winning. There was a gentleman named Daniel Ellsberg who worked on a project. The project, which was assigned by the Department of Defense and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, was to be a history book, really, of Vietnam. And this would have been in the 6th or 7th year of the war or our presence in Vietnam. And the notion was that we need to understand what went right, what went wrong, so we can learn by any mistakes we did make. And so this document was being created with taxpayer dollars that recapped exactly what happened in the Vietnam War. Strategy, decisions, politics, all of that. Valuable document. And it was done, most important, it was done while the war was still raging and while many believed the war should not be fought. Well, the report was done and it was not shared with the public. Its existence was not shared with the public. It was just put away on a shelf. And this gentleman, Daniel Ellsberg, decided this was important information for the public to have and leaked it to the New York Times. And all hell broke loose. The Nixon administration, President Richard Nixon, the president from beginning in 1968, did something surprising because this report made his predecessors look bad, particularly Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president of the United States, in the wake of JFK's assassination. It made Johnson look bad, and he did not have to try to punish somebody for releasing these documents. But he was a law and order candidate. He had someone named Henry Kissinger in his administration who urged him to show these newspapers that they can't get away with publishing things that are classified, which the report was. Anyway, the New York Times published 3 of these papers. And then a federal court told them they could not. Well, think about that. We have a power to publish anything in America, but a federal court said you may not publish this. And then you may have seen the movie, The Post. It's about this moment in American history. The Washington Post decides, well, you just shut up the New York Times, so we're going to start printing these. And they started running them. And when they were taken to court, they found a federal judge was more receptive to the First Amendment argument and did not order them to stop publishing. This was appealed. 14 other newspapers joined in and started publishing these in defiance of the government. It all ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court. And the court, in a critically important decision, supported the First Amendment and the publication of that information. It was essential, an essential decision. And here's what Justice Black had to say. Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government. And paramount among the responsibilities of a free press is the duty to prevent any part of the government from deceiving the people and sending them off to distant lands to die of foreign fevers and foreign shot and shell. Eloquent. And then you think about it. This is, well, the Bill of Rights is ratified in 1791. That's when we get freedom of the press in writing. And we are now 179 years later, and the Supreme Court uses those same 45 words to decide that the government can't shut down the publication of articles that make the government look bad and are not justifiably kept from the public. Wow. That's a sign of pretty good drafting in 1791. But it is also a measure of how powerful the idea of a free press remained in American society as of the 1970s. This is no small thing. It is truly the ability of the people to report on what the government is up to and to do it without fear of being shut down or being sued unfairly. That's essential. It's really the cornerstone of a democracy. And yet, that whole concept is only part of the importance of freedom of the press. I want to call your attention to the preamble of the U.S. Constitution. The important parts of this, well, there are many, but in order to form a more perfect union, that's what we said when we established the Constitution. We were determined to create a more perfect union. But when you look at it, they didn't do a terrific job of that. They left African Americans and those who had been brought in from Africa, they left them as slaves. They left women without a vote, without a voice in society, with very little power or influence. The number of people who remained oppressed under this new U.S. Constitution, was a significant percentage of the American population. If you were white and owned property, you had all the rights and you had all the power. So how do we address that? Well, what happened is, to make this a more perfect union, people exercised their First Amendment rights. Those 45 words are what change everything. So, the Liberator, newspapers that took a stand against slavery. Abolitionist newspapers thrived in the 1800s and brought to the public what they needed to know and made the case that slaves needed to be freed. Well, how about the fact that we do not give women the vote? Well, there are the suffrage newspapers who made the same case, who until 1920 fought the good fight to make sure women got the vote. The whole notion of women's liberation being something of the 70s is nonsense. Women had been fighting for their freedom since 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. The good fight continued. This is the Afro-American from the civil rights era, taking the truth to the people. And today, you might say, what does freedom of the press supporting civil rights look like? Well, it looks just like this. The free press that exists on Twitter. Words written in cyberspace, as they used to call it. Words written on the web, shared with a global audience. Exactly what a free press once did. Sure, traditional news outlets are still the press, still take a stand, still make a difference. And you can see that, the Me Too movement. There's Time magazine celebrating the silence breakers, reporting on the Me Too movement. And of course, you don't have to go very far then to go right there to Twitter and see that hashtag. Every new social media advance is a new vehicle. It's exactly the same as public occurrences, both foreign and domestic. It was somebody sharing ideas with somebody else, and hopefully with as wide an audience as possible, and telling government to butt out. Since 1997, the Supreme Court in that year decided that the internet is fully protected by the First Amendment, and by and large, it has remained unassailed. It has remained a very free vehicle as long as you're posting your content here for this audience. Of course, there's no guarantee that your ideas will be available in another country that doesn't have our liberties. I want to close here with just one quick return to the 45 words of the First Amendment. I'm concerned that a good number of Americans don't really understand the beauty, the glory that is 45 words. In fact, only 2% of Americans can tell you the 5 freedoms. A full third of Americans cannot name a single freedom in the First Amendment. If you're keeping track, that would be 110 million people with no idea what that thing says. And yet it is the very set of liberties that keep us free. It is the very set of liberties that keep any political party from taking over, from establishing a totalitarian country. It is the ability of the public and the press to speak out against injustice and to make a difference. And as you've seen in the examples, we have done that for centuries. To eliminate slavery, to take a stand for women, to fight for civil rights. Those voices are what made this a more perfect union. It is not a coincidence that the most powerful, dynamic, creative, giving, successful nation in the history of the planet is also the most free. And I just want to ask you on this sunny day on a fine American campus to take note of the fact that just as millions and millions of Americans have taken a stand in support of those 45 words, we need you to do that today. These 45 words, the right of expression, the right to take a stand, the right of a free press, are under pressure we have never, ever seen before. And astonishingly, a huge percentage of the American people seem to think that a free press is something we don't need, that it's fake news, that it's purely a vehicle of propaganda. You can't trust it. You need to trust somebody else's conspiracy theory on some unnamed website. This is an epidemic, and I'm not talking about COVID. This is an epidemic turning away from the core principles of American justice and democracy. You have to seek out information. Freedom of speech is valuable, but so is listening, and we can't make enemies of each other all the time. The beauty of the First Amendment is you have your ideas, I have mine, and let the best emerge. So in this war on the First Amendment that I'm perceiving here today, I want to remind you that you're the generation. You're on the front lines of this war. And if we are to remain a country committed to the free flow of ideas and the reporting of information to the populace, it's time to take a stand. Thank you all very much.